The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, casting rainbow patterns across the white marble floor. Emma Rodriguez stood at the altar in her grandmother's wedding dress, the ivory silk flowing around her like water. The dress had been altered 3 times to fit her petite frame, each stitch sewn with love and hope for this day. But now, as she stood alone at the front of the church, those hopes felt as fragile as the delicate lace on her sleeves. The chapel was filled with guests who had traveled from near and far to witness what should have been the happiest day of her life. Her family occupied the first 3 rows on the left side, their faces a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. Her mother sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while her father's jaw was set in a hard line that Emma recognized as his attempt to control his temper. On the right side of the church, where David's family and friends should have been sitting, there were only empty pews. The silence from that side of the chapel felt heavier than the murmurs of confusion from her own guests. Emma's hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. She had picked each flower herself from the garden behind her apartment, spending hours the night before arranging them into the perfect bundle. The roses had been David's favorite, and she had imagined him smiling when he saw them as she walked down the aisle. But David wasn't here. Father Martinez stood beside her, his weathered hands folded patiently as he waited. He had known Emma since she was a child, had watched her grow up in this very church, and his kind eyes now held a sadness that made her chest tighten with pain. "Perhaps we should wait a few more minutes," he suggested gently, his voice barely audible above the growing whispers of the congregation. Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She kept her eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church, willing them to open, willing David to come rushing in with an explanation and an apology. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe there had been an emergency at work. Maybe he was just running late, as he sometimes did when he got caught up in his projects. But deep in her heart, Emma knew the truth. David wasn't coming. The realization had been building slowly over the past few weeks. The way he had been distant during their final wedding preparations. The way he had avoided talking about their honeymoon plans. The way he had seemed more interested in his phone than in her when they were together. 3 days ago she had found the letter he had left on her kitchen counter. His handwriting, usually so confident and bold, had looked shaky and uncertain on the page. He was sorry, he had written, he wasn't ready for marriage. He needed time to figure out what he really wanted from life. He hoped she would understand, but Emma hadn't understood. They had been together for 2 years. They had talked about their future, planned their wedding, chosen names for the children they hoped to have someday. How could someone just walk away from all of that without even having the courage to say goodbye in person? She had torn up the letter and thrown it away, telling herself that David would come to his senses, that he would realize he was making a mistake, that he would show up at the church today, ready to commit to the life they had planned together. Now, as the minutes ticked by and the doors remained closed, Emma felt the last of her hope crumbling away. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. She didn't want her guests to see her cry, didn't want their pity or their whispered conversations about poor Emma, and how she had been left at the altar like something out of a tragic movie. Her sister Rosa started to rise from her seat in the front row, clearly intending to come and rescue her from this humiliation. But Emma shook her head slightly, stopping her. She needed a moment to gather her thoughts, to figure out how to gracefully end this disaster and send everyone home. The chapel had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing that something was very wrong. Emma could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. She took a deep breath and turned to face the congregation, preparing to speak, to apologize for wasting their time and to thank them for coming to witness what had turned out to be nothing at all. But before she could say a word, the heavy doors at the back of the church creaked open. Emma's heart leaped, and for a wild moment she thought David had finally arrived. But the man who stepped into the chapel was a complete stranger. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Emma made in 3 months. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and even from the altar she could see that his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. There was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of confidence and success, of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. The stranger paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the chapel until they found Emma. For a moment that felt like eternity, they simply looked at each other across the length of the church. His gaze was intense but not unkind, and Emma found herself unable to look away. Then he began walking down the aisle. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each step deliberate and sure. The guests turned in their seats to watch him, confusion and curiosity written across their faces. Emma heard her mother gasp softly, and her father half rose from his seat as if preparing to intervene. But the stranger continued walking until he reached the altar, where he stopped directly in front of Emma. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep green, almost the color of the forest after rain. There were small lines around them that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious and focused. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, perhaps 10 years older than Emma, and there was something about his presence that made the spacious chapel suddenly feel intimate. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said quietly, his voice warm and steady. Emma stared at him in bewilderment. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. I don't know who you are." The stranger smiled then, and it transformed his entire face. "My name is Alexander James," he said, loud enough for the entire congregation to hear. "And I'm here to marry you, if you'll have me." The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Emma's mother actually stood up this time, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Father Martinez looked between Emma and Alexander with obvious confusion. "I don't understand," Emma whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level only she could hear. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I've been watching you for months." "Not in a creepy way," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "I own the coffee shop across from the flower market where you work. I've seen you there every day, arranging bouquets, helping customers, always with such care and kindness." Emma's mind was reeling. She did remember seeing a man sometimes at the coffee shop, usually sitting by the window with a laptop and papers spread across his table. But she had never paid much attention to him, never imagined he had been paying attention to her. "I've wanted to introduce myself for months," Alexander continued, "but I could never find the right moment. Then this morning I saw the wedding announcement in the paper, saw your picture, and I realized what was happening. When I drove by and saw all the cars still here, well past the time the ceremony should have started." "You came to a stranger's wedding?" Emma said, still trying to process what was happening. "I came because I couldn't bear the thought of someone as wonderful as you being hurt. And because I've been hoping for a chance to get to know you better." Emma looked out at the congregation, at her family's shocked faces, at the empty pews where David's loved ones should have been sitting. She thought about the letter he had left, about his cowardice in running away instead of facing their problems together. She thought about all the dreams she had built around a man who had ultimately proven himself unworthy of them. Then she looked back at Alexander, this stranger who had walked into her darkest moment and offered her something she had never expected. Not love, not yet, but possibility, hope, a chance to write a different ending to this story. "Why would you want to marry someone you don't even know?" she asked. Alexander's smile was gentle and honest. "Because sometimes you meet someone and you just know. I've watched you for months, Emma. I've seen your kindness with difficult customers, your patience with children, the way you light up when you create something beautiful. I know it sounds impossible, but I feel like I already know the important things about who you are." "This is insane," Emma whispered. "Yes," Alexander agreed. "Completely insane. But sometimes the best things in life are." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, trying to think clearly. When she opened them again, Alexander was still there, still looking at her with those kind green eyes, still offering her a choice she had never imagined having to make. She thought about David, about the safe, predictable life they had planned together. A life that had ultimately meant so little to him that he could walk away from it without a second thought. Then she thought about this moment, about the courage it must have taken for Alexander to walk into a church full of strangers and make such an incredible offer, about the fact that he had seen her pain and wanted to do something about it, even if that something was completely unconventional. Emma looked at Father Martinez, who was watching the entire exchange with fascination and concern. "Father, is this even legal? Can we actually do this?" The elderly priest smiled. "Well, my dear, you both appear to be adults. You're both here of your own free will. I have the marriage license with your name on it, and if this young man has proper identification, tinily at Alexander?" "I do," Alexander confirmed, pulling his wallet from his jacket pocket. Father Martinez nodded. "Then, technically, yes, we can proceed. Though I do think you should take a moment to consider what you're doing." Emma looked out at her family again. Her mother was crying now, whether from relief or shock Emma couldn't tell. Her father looked like he was still trying to decide whether to throw Alexander out of the church or shake his hand. But Rosa, her sister, was smiling. Through her tears, Rosa was actually smiling, and when their eyes met, she nodded encouragingly. Emma turned back to Alexander. "If we do this," she said slowly, "what happens next? We don't know each other. We don't love each other. How do we make a marriage work?" "We take it one day at a time," Alexander replied. "We get to know each other. We see if this feeling I have, this certainty that you're someone special, is something real, and if it is." He paused, reaching out to gently touch her hand. "If it is, then maybe we'll find something even better than what you thought you had before." Emma looked down at their joined hands. Alexander's fingers were warm and steady, so different from David's nervous, fidgety touch. There was something calming about his presence, something that made her feel safe even in the midst of this impossible situation. "Okay," she heard herself saying, "let's do this." The chapel erupted in surprised chatter, but Alexander squeezed her hand and everything else faded into the background. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. Emma smiled for the first time all day. "No, I'm not sure at all. But I'm tired of playing it safe with people who don't appreciate what they have. Maybe it's time to take a risk on someone who does." Father Martinez cleared his throat and addressed the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Emma Rodriguez and—" He looked questioningly at Alexander. "Alexander James," the stranger supplied. "Alexander James," Father Martinez continued. "If anyone has any objections to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." The chapel was silent except for the sound of Emma's mother crying softly into her tissues. And so, surrounded by confusion and wonder, Emma married a stranger who had walked into her life at exactly the moment she needed someone to believe in her worth. As they exchanged simple vows and Alexander slipped a plain gold band from his own finger onto hers as a temporary wedding ring, Emma felt something she hadn't expected. She felt like she was finally exactly where she belonged. The kiss was gentle and sweet, and when they broke apart, Alexander whispered, "Hello, Mrs. James." Emma laughed, surprising herself. "Hello, Mr. James. I think we have a lot to talk about." "We have the rest of our lives," he replied, and for the first time in weeks, Emma believed that might actually be true.